Andy Gibb was the most beautiful man in disco, but beauty was never his salvation. Fame was his poison. On March 10, 1988, he lay dying in an Oxford hospital bed at age 30. His heart literally broken by a combination of cocaine, heartbreak, and the crushing weight of expectations he had never asked to carry. The youngest Gibb brother, who had once commanded screaming crowds and dominated the Billboard charts, was about to become another cautionary tale about the price of stardom. Fame had swallowed Andy Gibb whole, just as he had predicted it would. The disco ball that had reflected his golden curls and perfect smile had stopped spinning years before his death. The brother who had desperately wanted to join the Bee Gees but was never truly accepted as an equal had learned that being almost famous was worse than being unknown. He had spent his entire adult life chasing the approval of audiences, lovers, and most painfully, his own family, only to discover that external validation could never fill the internal void that had been carved out by a childhood spent in the shadow of genius. This wasn't just another story of a pop star who partied too hard and died too young. This was something more complex and heartbreaking. The account of someone who had been manufactured for stardom but never equipped for survival, who had been given everything except the tools to handle having everything, and who had confused being loved by millions with being lovable as a person. The world would remember Andy as the teen heartthrob who sang "I Just Want to Be Your Everything" and "Shadow Dancing." The golden boy whose voice could make young girls faint and whose smile could sell records by the millions. But the man behind the music was someone entirely different, a sensitive soul who had been packaged as a product, who had confused professional success with personal worth, and who had slowly poisoned himself trying to maintain an image that had nothing to do with who he actually was. By the time myocarditis claimed his damaged heart, Andy had spent over a decade learning that fame was not the answer to loneliness but often its cause, that being desired by everyone often meant being truly known by no one, and that the disco era that had made him a star had also created the pressures that would ultimately kill him. But to understand how someone could achieve everything the music industry promised would bring happiness, while simultaneously losing everything that actually mattered, we must return to the beginning. To a young boy on the Isle of Man who learned early that being talented was both a gift and a burden, who discovered that family love often came with conditions, and who would spend his entire adult life trying to prove he was worthy of the name Gibb. The story begins not with disco balls and screaming fans, but with a question that would haunt Andy Gibb his entire life. If you're born into musical royalty, why do you still have to audition for acceptance? March 5, 1958. Andrew Roy Gibb was born on the Isle of Man into a family where music was not just a profession but a religion, and talent was not just encouraged but demanded. His father, Hugh, was a drummer and band leader whose own frustrated musical ambitions had been transferred wholesale onto his sons. His mother, Barbara, was the family organizer whose job was to manage the chaos that came with raising multiple gifted children in a household where success was measured in chart positions and applause. But Andy was born 9 years after his twin brothers Robin and Morris, and 11 years after Barry, which meant he entered a world where the hierarchy had already been established and his role had already been determined. He would be the baby brother, the afterthought, the one who watched from the sidelines as his older siblings built an empire that would eventually dominate popular music worldwide. The family's move to Australia when Andy was a toddler should have been a fresh start, but it instead became the beginning of a pattern that would define his entire life. Constantly being uprooted, constantly being asked to adapt to new circumstances, and constantly being reminded that his needs were secondary to the family's musical ambitions. Andy learned early that stability was temporary, that home was wherever the music was, and that his value as a person was tied to his ability to contribute to the family enterprise. From his earliest memories, Andy understood that he lived in a world where normal childhood experiences were sacrificed for professional opportunities. While other children played games or developed hobbies, the Gibb boys were rehearsing harmonies, learning instruments, and performing at local venues. Andy was absorbing this lifestyle before he was old enough to understand what he was giving up in exchange for it. But there was something different about Andy's relationship to music compared to his brothers. Barry, Robin, and Maurice seemed to approach songwriting and performing as natural extensions of their personalities. They were born collaborators who fed off each other's creativity and seemed genuinely energized by the competitive aspects of the music industry. Andy, by contrast, was more sensitive, more romantic, and more interested in music as emotional expression than as commercial enterprise. Could this fundamental difference in temperament have been what made both his early success and his eventual destruction inevitable? The early signs of Andy's musical gift were evident by the time he was in primary school. He had inherited the family's natural ear for melody and harmony, but he had also developed something his brothers hadn't possessed at his age: an instinctive understanding of how to connect emotionally with audiences. When Andy performed, even as a child, people didn't just hear the music, they felt something deeper and more personal. But this emotional sensitivity, which would later become his greatest professional asset, was also his greatest personal vulnerability. Andy experienced feelings more intensely than his brothers, took criticism more personally, and struggled more significantly with the inevitable rejections and disappointments that came with pursuing a music career. He was developing the kind of artistic sensitivity that could create beautiful music, but that could also be devastated by the cruel realities of the entertainment industry. His childhood was spent watching his older brothers achieve the kind of success that most musicians only dream about. The Bee Gees' transformation from Australian pop stars to international sensations happened during Andy's formative years, which meant he was constantly surrounded by evidence of what musical success could look like while being reminded that he was not yet part of it. The family dynamics during this period were complicated by the brothers' increasing fame and the pressures that came with managing a successful musical act. Andy was often left with relatives or family friends while his brothers toured, which reinforced his sense of being peripheral to the family's main business. He was a Gibb by birth, but not by professional standing, and that distinction would haunt him for the rest of his life. By his early teens, Andy was displaying all the signs of someone who had inherited his family's musical gifts, but who was struggling with the psychological costs of growing up in their shadow. He was talented enough to know he could have a career in music, but insecure enough to wonder whether he would ever be taken seriously as anything other than the little brother of the Bee Gees. The decision to pursue his own recording career wasn't just about artistic ambition. It was about psychological survival. Andy needed to prove to himself and to his family that he was more than just a genetic afterthought, that he had value independent of his brother's achievements, and that the Gibb name could be associated with his success rather than just their generosity in helping him. But what Andy didn't understand was that entering the music industry as the youngest Gibb brother meant he would never be judged solely on his own merits. Every song would be compared to the Bee Gees' catalog. Every performance would be analyzed for evidence of family influence, and every success would be attributed partly to his brother's assistance. He was stepping into a spotlight that would always be shared, pursuing individual recognition in a context that made individuality nearly impossible. The late 1970s music industry that welcomed Andy was perfectly designed to amplify both his gifts and his vulnerabilities, and the disco era that would make him a star was also the cultural moment that would begin his destruction. The transformation from Andy Gibb, the youngest brother of famous musicians, to Andy Gibb, international pop sensation, happened with a speed that was both thrilling and psychologically devastating. His first single, I Just Want to Be Your Everything, released in 1977 when he was just 19, shot to #1 in multiple countries and established him as the newest teen heartthrob in a music industry hungry for fresh faces and romantic ballads. But success at that level and at that age was like being hit by lightning. Exhilarating and potentially fatal. Overnight, Andy went from being a relatively unknown younger brother to being one of the most recognizable faces in popular music, and he was completely unprepared for the psychological impact of that transformation. The boy who had spent his entire childhood seeking approval suddenly had millions of people screaming his name, but the validation felt hollow because it was based on an image rather than authentic knowledge of who he was as a person. The pressure to capitalize on his initial success was enormous. Record executives, family members, and entertainment industry professionals all had opinions about what Andy should do next, what image he should project, and how he should leverage his newfound fame into sustainable career success. But nobody was discussing how a teenager was supposed to maintain psychological stability while being treated as public property. The follow-up singles Love Is Thicker Than Water and Shadow Dancing cemented Andy's status as a major recording artist, but they also established a pattern that would define and ultimately destroy his career. Each new release had to be bigger than the last, each performance had to be more energetic, and each public appearance had to reinforce the image of Andy as the golden boy who had everything going for him. The disco era was perfectly suited to Andy's natural charisma and romantic appeal, but it was also a cultural moment that celebrated excess, hedonism, and the kind of lifestyle choices that could be exciting in the short term but devastating in the long term. Andy was being encouraged to embody the disco lifestyle, the parties, the glamour, the sexual freedom, the drug experimentation, because it made him more marketable to audiences who wanted their pop stars to be living embodiments of their fantasies. Behind all that glamour and global attention, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The relationship with Victoria Principal began as a fairy tale that the entertainment press couldn't resist, the beautiful actress from television's biggest hit show and the golden boy of disco music. But for Andy, it represented something more dangerous. The first time someone had claimed to love him for who he was, rather than what he could provide. The relationship became both his salvation and his destruction, a mirror that reflected all his insecurities about whether he was lovable as a person or simply valuable as a commodity. Victoria was successful in her own right, which should have made the relationship more equal. But Andy's insecurity transformed her independence into evidence that she didn't need him. Every script she read for Dallas, every scene she filmed with other actors, every moment she spent focused on her own career became proof in his mind that he was replaceable, that his value to her was temporary and conditional. The cocaine use that had begun as occasional party experimentation became Andy's attempt to become the version of himself that he believed Victoria wanted. More confident, more energetic, more worthy of someone who could choose to be with anyone. But the drugs that were supposed to make him more attractive were actually making him less reliable, more paranoid, and increasingly unable to distinguish between his genuine feelings and his chemically altered perceptions. The fights that began to characterize their relationship weren't really about the surface issues they appeared to address. Missed dinners, forgotten commitments, public embarrassments. They were about Andy's fundamental belief that he was not enough, that his success was temporary and his appeal was artificial, and that anyone who really knew him would eventually leave. Victoria's attempts to reassure him were interpreted as evidence that she was lying, and her frustration with his behavior was seen as confirmation that his worst fears about himself were true. When the relationship finally ended in 1982, it wasn't because Victoria stopped caring about Andy. It was because she could no longer compete with his addiction and his self-hatred. She had tried to love someone who didn't believe he was lovable, to support someone who interpreted support as pity, and to build a future with someone who was convinced he didn't deserve one. The breakup sent Andy into a spiral that was deeper and more dangerous than anything he had experienced before. The woman who had represented the possibility of authentic love had confirmed his belief that he was fundamentally flawed, that his success was built on deception, and that anyone who really knew him would eventually abandon him. The cocaine that had once been a recreational escape became a necessity for numbing the emotional pain that felt unbearable without chemical intervention. But perhaps most devastating was the way the end of the relationship was covered by the entertainment press. Instead of being treated as a private matter between two people trying to navigate the complexities of love and addiction, it became another chapter in Andy's public story, analyzed and dissected by people who had never met either of them but felt entitled to opinions about their compatibility and their failures. The narrative that emerged painted Andy as the self-destructive bad boy who had thrown away his chance at happiness with a successful, stable woman. The coverage reinforced every negative belief he had about himself while providing no context for understanding addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. He was being judged by people who had no comprehension of the psychological forces that were driving his behavior, and their judgments became part of his internal soundtrack of self-criticism. The attempted comebacks that characterized the mid-1980s were Andy's desperate efforts to prove that he could still be the person who had once seemed to have everything. Each rehabilitation program was approached like a recording session. If he could just get the performance right, if he could just follow the script perfectly, he could return to being the golden boy who commanded screaming crowds and topped the charts. But recovery from addiction isn't a performance that can be perfected through rehearsal and willpower. It requires rebuilding an entire relationship with yourself, with reality, and with other people, and Andy had never learned those skills because his entire adult life had been spent performing rather than living authentically. The family interventions that were staged during this period were complicated by the fact that the Bee Gees were not just his brothers. They were also a business entity whose reputation and financial interests could be affected by Andy's behavior. The love they felt for him was genuine, but it was entangled with professional considerations that made it difficult to separate personal concern from brand management. Barry, Robin, and Maurice wanted to help their youngest brother, but they were also dealing with their own career pressures and personal challenges. The music industry had changed since their initial success, and they were working to maintain their relevance while dealing with their own substance use issues and relationship problems. Andy's crisis was happening at a time when they had limited emotional and professional resources to dedicate to saving him. The conversations that took place during these interventions often felt more like business meetings than family gatherings. There were discussions about contracts, tour schedules, and public relations strategies, but less focus on the underlying psychological issues that were driving Andy's self-destructive behavior. The family loved him, but they didn't understand addiction as a medical condition that required professional treatment rather than moral persuasion. The financial pressures that mounted during Andy's decline were particularly humiliating for someone who had once commanded enormous fees for his performances. The lifestyle that had seemed effortless during his peak success was revealed to be unsustainable without constant income, and the expenses associated with his drug use, not just the cost of the substances themselves, but the legal fees, medical bills, and career opportunities lost due to unreliability, created a spiral of debt that made recovery even more difficult. Andy was forced to sell personal possessions that had sentimental value, to default on financial obligations that affected his credit and his reputation, and to accept lower-quality professional opportunities that damaged his artistic credibility. The golden boy who had once been considered a sure bet for commercial success was becoming known as someone who couldn't be trusted to fulfill his commitments, which made it increasingly difficult to find work that could provide the income necessary to address his financial problems. But the most painful aspect of his decline was the growing isolation from the people who had once been part of his inner circle. Friends and romantic partners who had been attracted to his celebrity status were less interested in supporting him through his struggles. And the few people who genuinely cared about him as a person were often unable to help because they lacked understanding of addiction, or because their own attempts to help had been repeatedly unsuccessful. The loneliness that had always been at the core of Andy's psychological struggles became more acute as his world grew smaller and more desperate. He was surrounded by people who wanted to use him, drug dealers who saw him as a reliable customer, hangers-on who hoped to benefit from any potential comeback, business managers who were more interested in protecting their own investments than protecting his health, but increasingly isolated from anyone who cared about his well-being. The prophecy he had made years earlier, "I don't think I'll see 40, was beginning to seem less like youthful melodrama and more like the accurate self-assessment of someone who understood that his lifestyle was unsustainable, but felt powerless to change it. Andy seemed to recognize that he was trapped in a cycle that would eventually kill him, but he was either unable or unwilling to make the fundamental changes that survival would require. More troubling was the growing recognition that his professional success was creating expectations that he was increasingly unable to meet. The record company wanted him to tour constantly, to record new material at an exhausting pace, and to maintain the kind of public profile that required him to be Andy Gibb, the pop star, even in private moments. He was losing the ability to separate his authentic self from his professional persona, and the stress of that confusion was driving him toward the drugs and alcohol that provided temporary relief but long-term destruction. The cocaine use that began as occasional party experimentation gradually became a necessity for maintaining the energy levels that his career demanded. Andy discovered that drugs could make him feel confident when he felt insecure, energetic when he felt exhausted, and charismatic when he felt empty. But he was also learning that the temporary solutions were creating permanent problems, and that each chemical escape made returning to reality more difficult. The pressure from his family to maintain the success that reflected well on the Gibb name was particularly devastating. Andy wanted desperately to be accepted as an equal by his brothers, but his solo career success had created a strange dynamic where he was commercially successful but artistically isolated. He was making money and attracting fans, but he wasn't part of the creative collaboration that had always been the heart of the Bee Gees' success. The missed opportunities to officially join the Bee Gees, the invitations that never came, the collaborations that were discussed but never materialized, became sources of profound disappointment that Andy tried to medicate with increasingly dangerous substances. He was successful by any objective measure, but he felt like a failure because he hadn't achieved the thing he wanted most: full acceptance into the family business. By the early 1980s, Andy was trapped in a cycle that would eventually kill him. He needed drugs to perform at the level his career demanded, but the drugs were making it impossible to maintain the career that justified their use. He was famous for being talented, but the substances he used to cope with fame were destroying the talent that had made him famous in the first place. The disco era that had made Andy a star was ending, and the musical landscape was changing in ways that made his romantic ballad style seem outdated and irrelevant. But Andy was so identified with his teen heartthrob image that reinventing himself artistically seemed impossible, and the thought of becoming irrelevant was more terrifying than the physical dangers of his drug use. The beginning of the end was already visible to those who knew him well, but Andy had become expert at performing health and happiness even when he was dying inside, and the entertainment industry was more interested in protecting its investment than protecting his life. Did this tragic event mark his downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point that revealed the depth of his long-hidden struggles? The early 1980s should have been a period of artistic maturation for Andy, a time when he could have leveraged his established fan base and industry connections into more sophisticated musical projects. Instead, they became years of increasingly desperate attempts to maintain relevance in a changing musical landscape while battling addictions that were destroying his ability to work consistently and effectively. The breakup with Victoria Principal in 1982 was both a symptom and a cause of Andy's accelerating decline. The relationship had been one of the few stable elements in his chaotic life, and losing it sent him into a spiral of self-destructive behavior that he was no longer able to hide from the press or his professional associates. The fairy tale romance that had been part of his public image became a very public failure that reinforced his growing sense that he was incapable of maintaining anything valuable in his life. More devastating was the growing recognition that his drug use was no longer occasional recreation, but had become a dependency that was affecting every aspect of his existence. Andy was missing recording sessions, showing up late or unprepared for performances, and alienating the industry professionals who had once been eager to work with him. The golden boy who had once been considered a sure bet for commercial success was becoming known as unreliable and difficult. The attempts at intervention by family members were complicated by the fact that the Bee Gees were dealing with their own career pressures and personal challenges. Barry, Robin, and Maurice wanted to help their youngest brother, but they were also protecting their own professional interests and couldn't afford to be associated with someone whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and potentially damaging to their reputation. The financial problems that resulted from Andy's inability to work consistently were particularly humiliating for someone who had once commanded enormous fees for performances and recording contracts. He was forced to sell personal possessions, default on financial obligations, and accept lower-quality professional opportunities just to maintain some income. The lifestyle that had once seemed effortless was revealed to be unsustainable without constant professional success. But perhaps most troubling was the growing isolation that resulted from Andy's inability to maintain relationships with people who weren't somehow connected to his drug use. The friends and romantic partners who had been attracted to his celebrity status were less interested in supporting him through his struggles, and the family members who genuinely cared about him were often unable to help because they didn't understand the depth of his addiction or the complexity of his psychological problems. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Or do some people simply learn to dance with those shadows until the music stops? The mid-1980s brought a series of failed comeback attempts that were more heartbreaking than his original decline. Andy would periodically enter rehabilitation programs, make public statements about his commitment to sobriety, and begin working on new musical projects, only to relapse into drug use and self-destructive behavior within months or sometimes weeks. The pattern became predictable. Periods of hope and apparent recovery followed by devastating crashes that left him worse off than before. Each failed attempt at sobriety reinforced his sense that he was fundamentally broken, that he lacked the willpower or character necessary to overcome his problems, and that he was destined to disappoint everyone who believed in him. The final years of Andy's life were spent in a strange limbo between fame and obscurity. He was still recognized by fans and occasionally offered performance opportunities, but he was no longer considered a serious recording artist or a reliable professional collaborator. He was living off the residual income from his earlier success while watching his reputation and his health deteriorate simultaneously. The relationship with his family during this period was particularly painful. His brothers loved him and wanted to help him, but they were also frustrated by his repeated failures to maintain sobriety and concerned about the impact his problems might have on their own careers. The family meetings and interventions that were meant to save him often felt more like business negotiations than expressions of familial affection. His final recording attempts in the late 1980s were shadows of his earlier work, technically competent but lacking the emotional authenticity and vocal power that had made his original hits so compelling. Andy was trying to recreate the magic that had made him famous while battling the physical and psychological damage that years of drug abuse had inflicted on his voice, his appearance, and his confidence. The prophecy he had made years earlier, "I don't think I'll see 40, was beginning to seem less like youthful melodrama and more like accurate self-assessment. Andy seemed to understand that his lifestyle was unsustainable, but he was either unable or unwilling to make the changes necessary to save himself. Were these final decisions acts of surrender? Or was Andy simply exhausted by the effort required to maintain hope in the face of repeated failure? The last months of his life were spent in a kind of suspended animation. He was living quietly, attempting to stay sober and occasionally discussing plans for new musical projects. But those who saw him regularly understood that he was running out of time. The damage to his heart from years of cocaine use was irreversible, and his body was beginning to fail in ways that no amount of willpower could overcome. The final collapse came suddenly but not unexpectedly. On March 10, 1988, Andy's heart finally surrendered to the cumulative damage of a decade of abuse, and he died alone in a hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment rather than the family and friends who had tried unsuccessfully to save him from himself. He was 30 years old, the same age as many musicians who were just beginning to hit their creative and commercial stride. But Andy had packed a lifetime of success and failure, love and loss, triumph and tragedy into his 3 decades, burning through experiences at a pace that his heart, literally and figuratively, could not sustain. The boy who had wanted nothing more than to be part of his family's musical legacy had instead become a cautionary tale about the dangers of fame, the destructiveness of addiction, and the particular vulnerabilities of sensitive souls who are thrust into the public spotlight before they're equipped to handle the pressure. March 10, 1988. The date marked not just the death of Andy Gibb, but the end of one of popular music's most heartbreaking stories of wasted potential and unnecessary tragedy. The man who died that morning had once been the most sought-after teen idol in the world, but he had spent his final years learning that fame without emotional foundation was like a house built on sand. Spectacular to look at, but ultimately unsustainable. The immediate response to his death revealed both the genuine affection that fans still felt for him and the shocking waste of someone who had possessed both extraordinary talent and extraordinary charisma. The obituaries focused on his musical achievements, the #1 hits, the screaming crowds, the golden boy image that had made him famous. But they struggled to explain how someone who had seemed to have everything could have lost it all so completely. The funeral in Miami was attended by hundreds of mourners, including his 3 brothers who served as pallbearers and who were visibly devastated by the loss of the baby brother they had tried unsuccessfully to save. The service was both a celebration of Andy's musical gifts and an acknowledgement of the tragedy that his life had become. A reminder that talent and success were not sufficient protection against the darker forces that could destroy even the most gifted individuals. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Barry Gibb, speaking for the family, acknowledged that they had failed to understand the depth of Andy's struggles until it was too late. The admission was both heartbreaking and honest, a recognition that love and good intentions were not always enough to save someone who was determined to destroy himself. Was his death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? In Andy's case, the hidden forces were systemic, an entertainment industry that manufactured teen idols without providing support systems for psychological health, a culture that celebrated excess without acknowledging consequences, and a family dynamic that created pressure for success without creating space for failure. The estate he left behind was modest, depleted by years of poor financial decisions and the expensive lifestyle that had been part of his public image. His most valuable possession was his catalog of recorded music, which would continue to generate income for his estate, but which also served as a permanent reminder of what he might have accomplished if he had lived long enough to mature as an artist. The impact on his family was profound and lasting. The Bee Gees continued to record and perform, but they were never quite the same after losing their youngest brother. The guilt and regret over their inability to save Andy affected their relationships with each other and influenced their approach to their own careers and personal lives. In the years following his death, Andy's story became a case study in the particular vulnerabilities of child stars and teen idols. Scholars, journalists, and entertainment industry professionals began to examine how the pressures of early fame could create psychological damage that lasted long after the initial success had faded. The music industry gradually developed better support systems for young performers. Though progress was slow and often incomplete, Andy's story served as a reminder that talent was not sufficient protection against the darker aspects of celebrity culture, and that the industry had a responsibility to protect its young stars rather than simply exploit their gifts. But perhaps the most significant aspect of his legacy was the way his music continued to resonate with audiences who recognized something authentic in his performances despite the manufactured nature of his image. Songs like "I Just Want to Be Your Everything" and "Shadow Dancing" remained popular decades after his death because they captured genuine emotions that transcended the specific circumstances of their creation. What hidden secrets might still remain untold behind his public image? In Andy's case, the biggest secret had been the depth of his insecurity and his desperate need for approval that no amount of commercial success could satisfy. His public image as the confident golden boy had been a carefully constructed fiction that hid a young man who never felt worthy of the love and admiration he received. The relationship between his commercial success and his personal destruction became a template for understanding how fame could be both blessing and curse, how the qualities that made someone marketable could also make them vulnerable, and how the entertainment industry's demand for perfection could destroy the very people it claimed to celebrate. As understanding of addiction and mental health issues improved, Andy's story was recontextualized as an example of how untreated psychological problems could be exacerbated by the pressures of celebrity culture. What had once been dismissed as weakness or moral failing was recognized as evidence of serious medical conditions that required professional treatment rather than moral judgment. The ultimate question that Andy's life raised, whether artistic success was worth the personal costs, or whether it was possible to achieve fame without sacrificing authenticity, remained unanswered. But his example demonstrated that the entertainment industry's promise of happiness through success was often a lie, that external validation could not heal internal wounds, and that the most beautiful voices could sometimes belong to the most broken hearts. He didn't need more applause. He needed a place to belong. Andy Gibb had been the disco prince, but more tragically, he had been a cautionary tale about what happened when sensitivity met celebrity without sufficient support or understanding. He had proven that it was possible to be loved by millions while feeling completely alone, to achieve everything the world said should make you happy while dying of spiritual starvation. He was packaged to be adored, not prepared to survive. In an industry built on manufactured dreams, Andy Gibb had lived an authentic nightmare. That fame could amplify rather than heal psychological wounds, that success could isolate rather than connect, and that sometimes the brightest stars burned out fastest not because they were weak, but because they felt everything too deeply in a world that rewarded performance over authenticity. Fame made him visible. Love never made him safe.